What if I told you that this bottle of frankincense essential oil in my hand is the victim of identity theft? Currently, the botanic community are killing off Boswellia carterii and lumping it in together with Boswellia sacra, which on the surface seems like a really simple name change, but it hides deep chemical differences that could become a clinical nightmare. Because if you cannot discern between the Arabian horse and the Somali zebra, then you could reach for a bottle of frankincense to treat osteoarthritis or a viral infection and wonder, why is my patient not getting any better? So today I'm going to delve into those chemical differences that the botanists ignored, to show you why a GCMS hides the truth, and also why receptors in our body can only respond to certain molecular handshakes, and why, because I'm worried about your clinical results, I refuse to let Boswellia carterii die. So we are going to get serious in this lecture, and I do need to break it down into smaller components to make it palatable. So these are they. First of all, I'm going to talk about how there has been a new species of Boswellia discovered and how its discovery has led to the extinction of the name Boswellia carterii. So that is botanical. It's about the trees. Then I'm going to move on to talk about the way that the terroir, the environment that the trees has grown on, actually alters the way that the tree makes its secondary metabolites and thus creates a different chemistry. And specifically that chemistry is about alpha-pinene, and then we're going to talk about how the different trees create different alpha-pinenes. Then we're going to go into what the differences between these alpha-pinenes looks like chemically. And then when we've finished all of that, we're going to go right back to the beginning and put those two arguments together, and for me to show that one is an Arabian horse and the other is a Somali zebra. So, onwards. Okay, so for the botany we have to go right back to 1867. And it should be said that the artist formerly known as Carterii, see what I did there, grows across Somalia and up into Yemen. But in 1867, a book published by the Austrian author Friedrich August Flückiger, the book was called Lehrbuch der Pharmakognosie des Pflanzenreiches, detailed details of the species Boswellia sacra. But then in 1870, George Birdwood, who was a British botanist and surgeon, went to Somalia and he said, wait a minute, no, this species I see here looks nothing like what's in that book. It must be a new species. He argued different leaves, different growth form, different flowers, got to be different. And so he decided he was going to name his new species after what was presumably somebody who had really inspired him. H.J. Carter, Henry John Carter, had been a worker for the East India Tea Company who had collected species extensively from Somalia and from Arabia. And so he said, right, I'm going to name this species after Carter. This is Boswellia carterii. And from that moment, it became known that Boswellia sacra was the name of the Arabian incense, or incense that came from the Arabian Peninsula. And if it was African, then we would say Boswellia carterii. And it stayed that way for around about 150 years until GCMS reports became advanced enough to reveal something very odd about the essential oil of Boswellia carterii, and that was that there was a chemical in there that shouldn't be there. Not only should it not be there for this particular frankincense, but actually it shouldn't be there for plants, because methoxydecane and methoxyoctane had only ever, as I understand it, been seen relating to millipedes, moulds or spider silks. So why was this in the GCMS report? So to begin with, I think that there was the argument then, well, in that case, this is adulterated and maybe there was some kind of foul play at hand. But then verification, really, that Birdwood must have been right, because if this made a different chemical to the Arabian one, then they must have been different species, right? But then a third version, a third idea came through, and that was, what if we're seeing a new chemotype? And in 2016, a paper was written, released by doctors Prabodh Satyal and Robert Papas, who put forward the idea that there must be a new chemotype. And their paper was called Biological Activity of a Novel Boswellia Chemotype, the Methoxydecane Frankincense. I didn't read that, honestly. And so this was put forward. Maybe there is a new kind of frankincense. How bloody exciting. Okay, so the search is on to find this new species, if it exists. And so to do that, need feet on the ground in Somalia. And so enter in two new people, Doctors Anjanette DeCarlo and Dr. Stephen Johnson. Stephen Johnson is an expert in supply chain, and DeCarlo has a doctorate from the University of Vermont in natural resources and environment. And DeCarlo had heard harvesters talking about two different trees. Now, we have to get interested in the naming, because they referred to Boswellia Carterii by several different names, sometimes Mohor Cad, sometimes Mohor Lab, but they also discerned another Mohor tree, which they called Bio or Mohor Maddo. And Mohor Maddo seemed different, and the harvesters kind of recognised that it was different, but they were putting all of the resins into the same sack together. So it became clear that perhaps this was the issue, and they needed to work out, well, which resin comes from which tree. And they spent a lot of time really isolating what resin came from where, and then they sent species samples to a gentleman called Matt Sterling, Dr. Matt Sterling, who was from the University of Uppsala, whose specialist area as a botanist was how lineages of plants spread across the world. And he looked really closely at them and he said, you're right, there is something different here. There is a new species we've never seen, a hidden species called Boswellia occulta. And this is the tree that the harvesters were calling Bio or Mohor Maddo. But when he took that out, he said, but also there's something else. What I can see then is what is Boswellia Carterii actually isn't different to what Flückiger explained way back in 1867. They're the same species. Birdwood was right in that they look different. They do have leaves that are different. They do have flowers that are different. They have a different growth structure, but the way that one sort of hangs off the side of a cliffside in Somalia and how one grows in a wadi in Oman, or the other way around, is related to just its reaction to the environment. They are the same species. And under the sort of taxonomical laws of naming, you should only go with the earliest name. So therefore, under superfluous naming, they did not need a new name of Boswellia Carterii. Hence why they say we should say Boswellia Sacra Flückiger. So we have two things to know here. First of all, that there is no such thing as a Carterii tree. It should never have been named that way. It was always a Sacra tree. But also that there is another new species called occulta, and occulta is why we were having this reading on GCMS reports of methoxydecane and methoxyoctane. So quite exciting, a new kind of frankincense that we didn't know about, which I'm not going to go into in depth here because it's a whole different thing, but does have traditional uses of its own that just had never been recorded. So this is why we're told, right, you should change the name to Sacra. There's never been a tree called Boswellia Carterii. It's Boswellia Sacra. My argument is partly, and we'll address the other part in a minute, that, yeah, but there's two oils in there. We know that. That's how it came about. It's not Sacra. It's Sacra and occulta. Okay? So this is why I'm saying that it's a zebra, because there's a black one and a white one in there. That's exactly what the harvesters were doing. They were throwing black ones and white ones. So that's the first part of my argument. But also, what I'm going to address in the next part is the terroir that Thulin was saying, well, it doesn't make any difference. That's just how it's grown differently because of the terroir. When it's distilled, and when we look at the secondary metabolites and how those change into essential oils, then those secondary metabolites exhibit themselves really differently. They become mirror versions of each other. And since the body can only process one version, not the middle version, they have really different properties. So that's the next part. Okay, for this part, you need to understand something called chirality, which we could best understand as handedness, and enantiomers, which are mirror versions of each other. So this is chemical. It's specifically stereochemical, but it's best understood using hands. And as you know, I like the easy way. Right, so if we put our hands up, we can see that they are made up of the same components. 5 fingers, a thumb, dirty palms, they are the same. But they are mirror versions of each other. And so, for example, if I tried to put a glove, the glove to this hand on the right, on that hand, it would be difficult. And even if we just kind of superimpose them, we can not superimpose mirrors over each other. This bit is enantiomers, this bit is chirality, right? And the understanding that some things require a right-handedness and some things require a left-handedness, right? So the terroir, the environment, the heat, the lack of water, whatever, makes the Boswellia sacra develop differently in Africa, sorry, I should do that hand, in Arabia to Africa, right? And because I'm lazy, I'm going to try and make it easy here and say Arabian frankincense and African frankincense. So the terroir of Arabian frankincense causes it to create 2 different enantiomers of alpha-pinene, right? A positive one and a negative one. And fundamentally, there are far more positive alpha-pinenes plus alpha-pinene and minus alpha-pinene. There are far more plus alpha-pinenes in Arabian Arabian frankincense. By contrast, the ratio is much lower in African frankincense. The ratio is about 0.68%. So yeah, fundamentally, this one has a positive ratio mainly. This one has a negative ratio. So they've both got alpha-pinenes of different sorts, positive and negative, but this one's got way more positive alpha-pinenes than this one that's got negative alpha-pinene. So these positive and negative actually make the oil perform in many different ways, differently to each other. So first of all, optical rotation. If you shine a light through the Arabian frankincense, it bends to the right. It is dextro-rotatory. If you shine a light through the African one, it is levo-rotatory, so it shines to the left. Also, enantiomers will quite often affect the fragrance of the essential oil, and so I'm going to look at my notes so I get this right, the right way around. So the Somali Sacra has a more piney fragrance because of these enantiomers, and the Omani one has a much more turpentine fragrance because of its enantiomers. It's this chirality that makes the difference. So we could say, well, okay, but all I need to do is to look at a GCMS to be able to say that. So I'm going to remember all of that information. I'm going to remember about the enantiomers, about the chirality. I'm going to remember which one's which. Good luck with that, because I'm confused and I've been studying it for 3 weeks now. And I can find it in a GCMS report. No, you can't. Because they're mirror images, which means they are the same molecular construction and the same molecular weight. So as you know, a GCMS report follows how fast molecules rise. Because of the same weight, they rise at the same velocity, so they show on the GCMS report as the same. You can find them, but you need a different test. You need a I think it's called a chiral tube to do it. So there is a way to isolate them, but what we're working with in GCMS reports won't work. So that's the first thing. But then in the next part, I'm going to show you that the two positive and negative alpha-pinenes have really different properties. Okay, so the eagle-eyed among you may think, well, oh, I don't think she's dressed the same, she hasn't got her hair quite the same, looks the same, but the candles aren't lit. This is because this is 5 days later, and I've come back to it and thought Saturday morning, I think I can explain what I did in that video better. So this is later. But I really wanted to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of why we do need to care about these enantiomers and the chirality. So let's start with the fact that you may have already come into contact with this, with carvone. So carvone, for example, the plus and minus act differently in caraway and spearmint. If you smell the carvone in each, you get a minty smell and a caraway-y smell. It's the carvone that's doing it, okay? And this kind of partly answers a question that I always think about when I'm thinking about olfaction generally. When we inhale a molecule, it goes to a piece of tissue on the back of the olfactory bulb, which has around, it's about the size of a dime, and has around about 100,000 receptors. And then those send messages along nerves to different parts of the brain to instruct them to do lots of things. But fundamentally, that 100,000 receptors helps us to understand and to interpret about 3 million different fragrances. And well, how does it do that? Well, enantiomers are part of that the chirality goes, oh, we've got a left-handed approach on this one, we've got a right-handed approach on this one, this left-hand one will send it to that sort of part of the brain that will interpret it as minty, this one will send it to that part of the brain that will interpret it as caraway, or kind of like a fennelly kind of smell, aniseedy kind of smell. So that also obviously happens within the body, and this kind of partly explains why essential oils don't have side effects. They have many main effects, because the body will go, okay, this one receptor can interact with a left-handed and right-handed, so it can do two things instead of one thing. And then also it will go, that alpha-pinene molecule can interact with this receptor in the body and that receptor in the body. So we have like this concentration of combinations and permutations of all the different things that can happen within the body. So it's lots of different layers involved. So for example, if we were to say, right, I want to analyse what positive alpha-pinene can do for bacteria against what it can do for viruses. I can tell you that the positive alpha-pinene is a much better bactericidal agent, and the negative one is a much better antiviral agent. And likewise, if you wanted to work with an essential oil that contains alpha-pinene to work with somebody who has osteoarthritis, then you definitely would want to go for the positive enantiomer, the positive alpha-pinene, because that one is shown to have tremendous anti-inflammatory effects, but also to affect the enzyme that involves MMPs, which are matrix metalloproteinases. Can't believe I got that right first time. Which are essentially like scissors on your bone, and they are what's responsible for breaking down cartilage and breaking down the bone in osteoarthritis. So we do want to inhibit those. The negative alpha-pinene kind of does it, but nowhere near as well. So it's kind of like a 9 out of 10 versus a 2 out of 10 response that you're getting by using the wrong frankincense essential oil. So does that mean that the Arabian frankincense is superior because it's got this positive alpha-pinene, and so therefore it would be better for osteoarthritis? Well, if we're thinking about osteoarthritis, yes, it does. But if we're thinking about bronchitis, then you might be better going for the African one, because that has a predominantly negative alpha-pinene profile, which we know is antiviral and particularly really good for bronchitis. So it really is like apples and oranges. They're completely different things. And so if we continue on this trajectory of saying, right, well, they're both Boswellia Sacra, well, we could read a textbook and go, right, frankincense for arthritis, maybe go for Boswellia Carterii because it's the cheaper option, usually it is more inexpensive, then think, well, this isn't working anywhere near as well as it should be because we've picked the wrong one. And likewise, we might look in a textbook and say, well, I'm going to choose Boswellia Sacra because there's loads and loads of evidence for this particular condition. Well, which Sacra from where? You just can't tell. So essentially, what we're doing by grouping them together from a purely selfish, like therapeutic point of view, is we're muddying 150 years worth of phytotherapeutical evidence, aren't we? It's just daft. However, if you were to retain the binomial nomenclature and say, right, Boswellia Carterii, we know that every time that we look at a clinical trial that says Boswellia Carterii can do that, we can go, okay, Boswellia Carterii can do that. I'm happy with that. And likewise, if we say we can see that Boswellia Sacra can do that, okay, I know what oil that I'm dealing with. And so we know that the results of what we're reading are pertinent to the essential oil that we're using. Now, I do recognise there is a fundamental problem with saying that this essential oil comes from a tree that doesn't exist. But actually, you know what? That's semantics. It is coming from the same botanical that it has always come from. And not just one botanical, a series of botanicals. And so it doesn't really matter, because the evidence that we have for Boswellia Carterii not only tells us what that version of the tree does, but it also tells us that it doesn't really matter if we've got Boswellia ferreriana in there or occulta, which happens, because that's always been the case and that's always been the profile, and we don't really know that much about what Boswellia occulta can do yet. And so if we kind of lose all that information. No, it's like saying, I only want to use my grandmother's perfect recipe for making apple pie. You know, that is the perfect recipe. If you muddy the water with the research, you just don't know, do you? Okay, so in the first video, I explained how the the Latin name of the botanical of the tree had changed. But importantly, the supply chain has not. And the whole argument was based on the discovery that Boswellia Carterii was a co-distillation of two resins. So according to Thulin's discovery, thanks to DeCarlo and Johnson's work, we do know that the supply chain delivers resins to distill that are a mix of Sacra, but also Occulta. It's not just Sacra, is it? And that's the crux of my argument. Do we know for certain that Occulta is in it? Well, actually, in 2019, Stephen Johnson released a paper and called The Chemical Composition of Boswellia Occulta Oleogum Resin Essential Oils 2019. And he says it's not changed. They're still putting two resins in together. Why would it change? They get paid on weight of resin. There's no incentive for them to change. And so we've really got a problem here, right? If we say that Boswellia Carterii is now Boswellia Sacra, not only do we have a chemical imbalance, but also we are ignoring the fact that it's a co-distillation. So it's very, very complicated. Now, for me, in these kind of situations, and incidentally, I should say, there's real conservation arguments for this. The reason behind Johnson's paper and other things that DeCarlo has written since is she says, well, you know, these are endangered species. I don't think Occulta is, but the others are. And so if we lump them all together as Sacra, then the research and the funding and whatever goes into one species. And they have different needs and different problems and different challenges that we need to be doing. And these are near threatened species, so they need all the help that they can get. So if you lump together everything as Sacra, you really divide the funding and the research and the attention that can be put on it exponentially. So from a conservation point of view, their argument is, no, please don't put Sacra and change Boswellia Carterii to Sacra. So the botanists say we should, the conservationists say that we shouldn't, the chemical says, no, they're not the same, they're not equal. Like I say, one is an Arabian stallion, the other one's a zebra. There's black and white mohair in there. Mohair cad, mohair maddow, that is black and white maddows. So there's two different things in there. So unless you understand how they are different to one another, you are going to keep making really bad clinical mistakes. The energetics are going to be wrong because they smell different. I'm not sure that the fact that the light going through them has that much difference to it as aromatherapist, but it does show that they are fundamentally different. Now, to be clear, the fact that the light shines through them differently, well, that happens with vetiver, right? So this isn't a new phenomenon. I show in my vetiver book that cultivated vetiver has a different optical rotation to wild vetiver that grows in the really hot bits. One's levorotatory, one's dextrorotatory. That's how you work out which is the superior one. We don't change the name because of it. It's just vetiver. And in the same way, some plants are really good at adaptation. Take Helichrysum italicum, for example. Again, in my Helichrysum book, I talk about how it's almost a joke for people who are like ethnobotanists to try and work out from traditional medicine, because that reacts almost from field to field, village to village, hill to hill. They create really different profiles. And to the outsider, it might sound like snobbery to say, oh, I only use Helichrysum italicum that comes from Corsica or Sardinia because it's high in neryl acetate. It's not. It's a really good clinical guideline to say I need the neryl acetate to do my job. But there's more at play than I need a positive or negative enantiomer here. It's a co-distillation. There's two resins in there. So this is really complicated. There's so many strands that come together. And so Occam's razor says, if there are different disciplines that all contradict each other, then the simplest solution is the best one. And the simplest solution is leave that name alone. Boswellia Carterii says this comes from Somalia. It is levorotatory. It has negative a ratio that is predominantly negative in enantiomers of Alpha-Pinene, and it smells this way, right? And the vibrational, I'm not even going to go into the vibrational energy here, but that also has a bearing. And so you know when you pick that up, it's not that different to when we buy an attar, right? An attar is a rose attar is a co-distillation with rose and sandalwood. So the Carterii label tells us this is not pure Sacra. This is Sacra and Occulta, and it comes from this part of the world where it's recognised. And by keeping it congruent to everything that went before, it doesn't get confusing of trying to look back at the research, because it's really relevant what Carterii can do. It's going to get really confusing if you ask what Sacra can do, because taking old references of Sacra aren't going to translate, are they? You've got one that's positive, one that's negative. It's all very confusing. So this is my argument for saying leave it alone. Please just leave it alone as Boswellia Carterii. Now, I want to be really clear when I say that there is a lot of argument for correct naming. I'm absolutely wholly on board with the fact that you should name species correctly in your recipes, in your essays, etc. if it makes sense. But this one doesn't make sense. I do believe that if you are writing for a journal or you're writing for an exam, you will get better marks by proving that you know that the name has changed. I will not write it differently. I am going to always refer to this document of saying, this is my defence. I'm not changing it the way that I label it. And I invite you to do the same. Use my blog post as your defence for saying, no, I understand I'm supposed to name it Boswellia Sacra, but I think that that has problems for me. I think it is misleading to my clients. I think it makes research more difficult, and I think it makes my capability to be accurate in what I'm prescribing harder. If I say this is Boswellia Carterii, I am very, very transparent in what I'm doing, but you must not just write it, you must put an asterisk and use this defence, because now we are being told this tree doesn't exist, and it doesn't. It's really confusing, but that is my solution, and I invite you to use it. I've just come outside into the sunshine for a moment, so rare here at the moment, just to ask you for a quick favour, and that is, if you're finding this content useful, please do click the like button for me. It will make such a difference to the algorithm, and maybe consider subscribing. It'll really mean that that YouTube shows this content to loads more people and gives them more of a chance to weigh their own convictions. And so yeah, if you can like and maybe subscribe, it will make such a difference to me. Thank you.